There are many stories about the foods of Italy. Tiramisu was created by ladies of the night to get their clients in the mood. Parmesan cheese has been prized for its special aroma for hundreds of years. Olive oil is the magical liquid of the Mediterranean people, giving them longer and healthier lives. And carbonara, cooked up by farmers and shepherds of the Apennine Mountains, using only the products they grew. So yeah, all of these stories are false. One man has even gone so far as to say that there is no such thing as Italian cuisine. Okay, bold claims. Let's look at all of them in a bit more detail. Before you leave a comment calling for our prompt execution, please note that none of these claims are ours. These are the claims of Alberto Grandi. Grandi is a historian at the University of Parma. They must really like him there. And he has gained some infamy by publishing a number of books claiming that Italy's food culture is a fabrication and more of a marketing exercise than actual tradition. Full disclosure, his books haven't been widely translated yet, and our Italian is at best Duolingo level. So we are relying on interviews he has given, which might be missing some nuance. But he did make claims to the effect of all the things we just said. We've left links down below if you want to read it for yourself. Let's start with tiramisu. A popular legend tells us that it was invented at the court of the Medici family during Firenze's Golden Age. Another, more famous origin story is that prostitutes in Treviso would give them to potential customers in order to get them in the mood for another round. Hence tiramisu, which can mean pick me up, but also pull me on top. However, all these stories are likely false, and the clue is in the recipe. Beat sugar, egg yolks, then mix with mascarpone. So far so doable in the Renaissance if we're not being too strict. Brew some strong coffee and dip Savoiardi or ladyfinger biscuits into the coffee. Or pour the coffee directly onto the biscuits. Coffee only arrived in the 16th century, so this rules out some of the earlier Medici. However, the later ones and the ladies of the night are still in the running. Then, layer the mascarpone mix over the ladyfingers. Repeat until you're out of biscuits or mascarpone. Now the key step. Place this aside for at least 10 hours in a refrigerator. Something 19th century bottles probably didn't have. So that tiramisu would have been a bit soft. And Alberto Grandi points this out. History backs him up. After all, the earliest mention of the dessert is from 1950s or 60s. There's a bit of debate. So Grandi is correct here. Score 1 to him. Next up, carbonara. It's got reputation for being this rustic product of good old-fashioned rural living, made only from the produce of the farmers and shepherds of the Apennine Mountains. They kept pigs, so there's guanciale. They had sheep, whose milk gave them cheese, pecorino romano. They had chickens, so there's eggs. And they grew wheat, so there's pasta, ideally spaghetti, the most basic and honest of pastas. Now, you might ask, what about the pepper? According to legend, those black flakes were not pepper, but charcoal. Flakes from burners used when cooking in the fields. As charcoal in Italian is carbonaro, the pasta was called carbonara. So if this story is true, to make real carbonara, you can only have these ingredients. No parsley, no garlic, and of course, no cream. Following that logic, shouldn't we swap the pepper with charcoal? Yeah, maybe not. Anyway, Grandi, as you might expect, isn't that convinced. He theorizes that carbonara was invented in Italy, but by American soldiers. Now, as Europeans, we are having none of this. So, we went digging and man's got a few points. We weren't able to find any written sources, but Eleonora Cosella went around interviewing people and was able to construct a good narrative. After the fall of Mussolini, a lot of American soldiers remained stationed in Italy. Some stayed in local inns and asked for something called spaghetti breakfast, which was apparently bacon and eggs with spaghetti. Now, because food was rationed at the time, local innkeepers had to turn to the black markets to get their ingredients. Often, that would mean getting them off these same soldiers. American K rations had canned bacon and cheese, and from the British rations they were able to procure egg powder. It does seem that American soldiers took the recipe with them, as the first written recipe we know of for carbonara was indeed from America. It was published in the 1952 guidebook Victuals and Vice, an extraordinary guide towards cooking on Chicago's near north side. One restaurant called Armando's served carbonara, and the recipe goes: boil 1.5 pounds of tagliarini, according to the directions on the package. Meanwhile, chop and fry 1/2 pound of mezzina. Drain the noodles and add the bacon. Take 4 eggs and add 1/4 pound of Parmesan cheese and lightly whip. Mix everything and toss over a flame. Serves full. You can see that this recipe is American, as it calls pasta noodles. Notable differences with today's standard carbonara were the lack of pepper, the use of Parmesan rather than pecorino, and the use of thick eggy pasta rather than just spaghetti. Back in Italy, the dish stuck around. The earliest recorded, though not written, mention of carbonara comes from an Italian film, Cameriera Bella Presenza Offresi. In this, a man interviews a potential housekeeper and asks her what she can cook. She replies that she can make things like lasagna and amatriciana, but shakes her head when he asks whether she can make carbonara. It does seem like that in the first years of carbonara, right after World War II, there wasn't much appetite for it in Italy. There were British and American recipes, some containing things like chili and minced clams. However, no written recipe emerged from Italy. Luca Cesari, whose book A Brief History of Pasta was a great help for this video, thinks that the mixture of bacon and eggs just came more natural to Brits and Americans than it did to Italians, as the former already had a fondness for bacon and eggs. It's only in 1954 that La Cucina Italiana, an authoritative Italian food magazine that's still going, published its first carbonara recipe. Next to the title is an asterisk with "upon request," as if to show that the editors didn't include the recipe because they wanted to, but because they had to. Now, if you are somebody who strongly believes that the carbonara only consists of guanciale, eggs, pecorino, spaghetti, and some pepper, you might want to look away. But before we get to that, if you've liked this video so far, please consider becoming a channel member. You get a little things like a badge behind your name. Also, from tier 2 onwards, you get access to members-only videos. If you just want to throw us some one-off support, you can do that using the thanks button. If you want to help us out, but not in a monetary way, absolutely fine. You can do that using the subscribe button or just leaving a like. Those are totally free and still help us out a lot. Thank you very much. Now, back to the oldest fully Italian carbonara recipe. For 4 people, we'll need 400 grams of dried spaghetti, 150 grams of pancetta, 100 grams of Gruyere, yes, Gruyere, the fancy cheese in the 1950s, a clove of garlic, yes, we know, 2 eggs, yes, just 2, salt and pepper. Shocked? We are just getting started. Chop the pancetta and dice the Gruyere, while you bring your water to the boil. Put in the spaghetti and let it boil for 15 minutes. The recipe actually mentions that al dente is better, though we're not sure how a 15-minute boil gets you al dente. Break the eggs into a bowl and beat as if making an omelette. In a large pan, fry the pancetta along with the crushed garlic. Once the pancetta is cooked, remove the garlic, add the spaghetti, eggs and the Gruyere, along with plenty of pepper. Keep the heat on, allowing the eggs to, and this is actually in the recipe, mildly set. Then serve immediately. We found this odd because the recipe doesn't tell us to cool down the pan, so the eggs do set straight away. So our advice is to keep stirring until the Gruyere has melted. The result is odd if you're expecting a modern creamy carbonara. This is a dry, almost crumbly texture. If we're honest though, not bad. It very much resembles what we think of when thinking spaghetti breakfast. In the late 50s and 60s, we see that pecorino and guanciale become more prevalent in Italian recipes. That is, alongside cream. Yes, cream was a solid element of carbonara all the way from the 80s through the 90s and into the early 2000s. A recipe from Gualtiero Marchesi from 1989 uses 320 grams of spaghetti, 80 grams of guanciale, 2 egg yolks, 2 grams of pecorino, 10 grams of butter and 250 milliliters of cream. It's only in the late 90s and especially in the 21st century that we see the cream begin to disappear and the recipe settle on its current form, that being pasta, pecorino, eggs and guanciale. Both Grandi and Cesari seem to say that the number of carbonara ingredients was reduced so the dish would fit better in the idyllic Italian stereotype of the rustic kitchen. And that to blindly and rigidly adhere to legend stifles innovation. They don't seem to be the only ones who think this. There's a very good channel here on YouTube called Italia Squisita, where Italian chefs showcase their skills and share recipes and techniques. A few years ago, they had a number of viral hits in which Italian chefs, who are considered authorities on a dish, reacted to YouTubers making their specialty dish. It was fun and played into some hilarious stereotypes. However, the channel themselves stopped making these videos as they said it risked creating a wrong image of Italian cuisine. Having said that, we think there is something to be said for a short list of ingredients, which has nothing to do with creating a culinary pedigree and everything to do with letting the ingredients shine. When actually listening to the criticism on Italia Squisita's reaction videos, the chef's reactions were less of a "oh no, this is sacrilege" and more sort of a "you don't need this," sometimes citing the Italian principle of cucina povera or poor kitchen, which uses fewer ingredients but utilizes each to its full potential. We've tried a version of carbonara with cream and garlic, and one with just the basic holy trifecta. And the leaner one felt less heavy and simply tasted nicer. When you think about it, isn't removing superfluous ingredients what modern cooking is all about? You know, getting to the core essence of the ingredient. So the push coming from Italy to stick to basic ingredients and nothing more might be more of a push for culinary quality rather than just blind jingoism. Having said that, the cliché of the Italian getting mad about the wrong ingredient being added is alive and well. But know that in this age of internet and algorithms, outrage gets amplified a lot more than subtle, nuanced suggestions. In addition, the only people who seemed actually outraged that we could find were politicians, not cooks. All things considered, it does seem that Grandi was right when it came to the carbonara not being this old sacred recipe cooked up by the shepherds in the Apennine Mountains, but rather a modern recipe, which is just as Italian as it is American, and even a tad British. So that does indeed put it at 2-0. So is this it? Are we about to conclude that, as per the title of Grandi's book, there is no such thing as Italian cuisine? Well, not yet. Grandi had 2 valid claims there. 2 claims that we, completely by coincidence, put at the front of our video. Some of Grandi's other claims don't hold as much water. For instance, Parmesan cheese is such a key ingredient in so many Italian dishes. It adds a nice little bit of tang and saltiness to risottos, tortellini fillings and, if nobody's watching, a good carbonara. Grandi admits that the history of Parmesan cheese goes back almost 2,000 years. However, he also claims that before the 20th century, Parmesan was a small cheese, which was very soft and milky, a bit like a brie. So milky that milk could be squeezed from it. In addition, the rind would be black, not the faint yellow we know today. According to Grandi, in Italy, this old method of making Parmesan was abandoned during the 20th century, but is still being done in Wisconsin. In an interview with El País, he calls present-day Parmigiano Reggiano a recently created substitute. Before automated milking and refrigeration, milk was indeed a more precious product. Therefore, cheeses tended to be a bit smaller. Without modern climate and humidity-controlled ripening rooms, Some cheeses were also covered in oil and charcoal. Mario Zanoni, food technician and all-round authority on Parmesan cheese, writes that we can trace the tradition to at least the year 1200. And the cheese wheels were indeed smaller. However, they were still 13 kilos rather than the present-day average of 38. So, not exactly what we would call small. Also, the cheese has always been hard, and the traditional way of making it was never abandoned. We even discussed a source on this channel referring to the cheese. The recipe from the 19th century, which we used to make our macaroni for Beethoven, contains Parmesan cheese. And it calls for the Parmesan to be grated. That's pretty hard to do with milky cheese. It also shows that the cheese was already known across Europe. So that's already 1 point for the Italian tradition. On olive oil, Grandi claims that it was used for centuries in Italy, but it only started being used for food in the 1980s. Because that's when the quality became fit for human consumption. Before then, it was mainly used in lamps, and Italians would cook with lard, margarine and butter instead. It is true that in modern times the consumption of olive oil has gone up in Italy and most of the world. But olive oil has been used in Italian food for centuries. Bartolomeo Scappi, for example, recommends using olive oil as a substitute for lard during Lent, all the way back in 1570. So, Grandi has a small point on the popularity of olive oil, but to say it was not eaten at all? Nah, we're not having that. So, that puts the score at 2-2, an annoying draw. We need a good tiebreaker. I have an idea. Something big. Something that a lot of people really care about. Yes. On pizza. Grandi says in his interview with Der Standard, pizza was invented in Naples, but it tasted awful. The dough was hard, burnt on the outside and still doughy on the inside, and there were no tomatoes. It was only through the Italian diaspora that pizza was further developed and improved in the USA. We'll be the judge of that, but that will be something for our next video, as pizza deserves its own video. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss our video, in which we see just how much influence the United States has had on pizza, and whether New York is more important than Naples.